Okay, hello everyone, this is Jasmine, and today we're going to be talking about game loops. As an overview, we're going to go over what game loops are, what feedback loops are, what arcs are, and then lastly, how to put all of these together to create an engaging game. So let's start off with the core gameplay loop. So what is a core gameplay loop? As you can see on the slide, a core gameplay loop is a loop that can't be removed without altering the fundamental nature of the game. So for Mario, this gameplay loop could be walking, running, and jumping. For Candy Crush, it's swapping candy positions. The elements of a solid core loop include clear objectives. So for Mario, the objective is to reach the end of the level, and Candy Crush is to make matches. Many games can have similar gameplay loops, but they feel distinct because of elements like level design. For example, when we look at Celeste vs. Mario, on paper they have essentially the same core gameplay loop of moving and jumping, but the gameplay feels distinct because of different level design. So again, at its core, Celeste and Mario have very similar gameplay loops, but their gameplay loops are so simple and easily extended upon that these games are taken to two very different places. A solid core loop should also be built on a concept that unifies your design choices. For example, Journey is designed around the idea of companionship. The core loop is movement, which the developers use to make the player feel alone as they wander through the vast desert. If the core loop was something like attacking enemies, this theme wouldn't be as present. So the core gameplay loop helps communicate the theme and feel of the game. And lastly, a good loop should be compelling. The core mechanic should fully engage the player, yet also challenge them. You want to keep their interest piqued for as long as possible. And just a note, these aren't strict rules or a checklist to making your game loop, they're just some guiding concepts to creating a strong loop. Okay, so let's try to analyze some of Breath of the Wild's game loops. So I'll just tell you what I believe Breath of the Wild's game loops are. So the core gameplay loop is moving around, attacking, and collecting items. The final objective is to defeat Ganon, and this is told pretty explicitly to the player through NPCs. Because the core gameplay loop of Breath of the Wild is so simple, again, it's moving, attacking, and collecting items, there are a lot of ways that Breath of the Wild expands on it. For example, for movement, you can go to new locations, like enemy camps and villages, and there's also dynamic terrain, like rain, snow, and storms. For collecting items, you can get armor and weapon upgrades, and there's also cooking. And for attacking, there's things like the weapon durability system. And all of these features combine into showing the theme of exploration. Now on to feedback loops. So feedback loops determine how the game reacts to player progress. And there are two main types of feedback loops: positive feedback loops and negative feedback loops. So for positive feedback loops, essentially this is if you do well in a game, then you get rewarded. If you do poorly, then you get punished. You can see this most often in RPGs. So if you defeat an enemy, then you're doing well in the game, right? So you get experience. When you get experience, you level up and get stronger, and when you get stronger, you can kill enemies faster, and so on and so forth. So when you can kill enemies faster, you get more experience, you level up again, etc. So this places a lot of emphasis on the early game and can also destabilize the game and cause it to snowball. A lot of RPGs kind of mitigate that effect by increasing the amount of experience you need to level up after every subsequent level. On the other hand, we have negative feedback loops, and this is when if you do well in the game, then the game punishes you, and if you're doing poorly in the game, then the game rewards you. You can see this in Mario Kart, where if you're the first place player, then you're doing very well, right? So the items you get from mystery blocks are pretty bad, like you only get bananas, and you can also get hit by the blue shell. If you're doing poorly in the game, so if you're in last place, then you get really good items like bullet bills. So negative feedback loops stabilize the game and can cause the game to last longer. However, if you overuse them, then you can send the player mixed messages. Like if the player is doing really well, but the game is punishing them and becoming harder, then the player would be like, why would I play well then? Might as well throw, right? So that's why balancing your feedback loops is really important. So let's try to use this example on Hades. So Hades is a roguelike where you kill enemies, and if you get further into the level, you can get more darkness, which is a reward that you can use to upgrade your skills, such as giving yourself more ammo or more damage. However, this can quickly snowball out of control because the difficulty of the game doesn't scale with the number of upgrades you have, so you can quickly become overpowered. So how does Hades balance this out? Well, Hades has this Pact of Punishment where you can make the game more difficult by increasing enemy damage, attack speed, and even giving bosses new abilities. So in this sense, the Pact of Punishment acts like a player-controlled negative feedback loop. If you're doing well in the game, you can choose to introduce new challenges in order to keep the gameplay balanced. The message here is that positive and negative feedback loops are both useful in rewarding the player and maintaining balance. So you have to use both of them to make sure that your game doesn't snowball out of control. Moving on to arcs. Arcs have a lot of similar elements to a loop, but they're not built for repeated usage. So an arc is essentially an interaction that can help the player build upon their mental model of a game, but unlike a loop, an arc exits after it's finished. The best example of an arc is a cutscene. So cutscenes can tell you a lot about the story or the mechanics of the game, but you don't go back to the cutscene after you've finished it. So arcs are a great way for conveying lots of information. Now we know about arcs and loops, how do you structure them? So here are some common ways to construct them. Sandwiches are when you move back and forth between cutscenes and gameplay. These are often seen in narrative games as it helps convey a lot of information while breaking that information up with gameplay. Another example of loops is parallel loops, where you use loops in music to supplement events and gameplay. You can see this used in Transistor, where there are 3 channels to the music. There's vocals, percussion, and like the rest of the music. So when you're walking around in the level, only the music channel is playing. But when you enter a battle, the percussion channel is unmuted, and suddenly the music gains a sense of urgency, which supplements the gameplay. Continuing on how to build your loops, the figure on the right is a good representation of how higher level loops build off of lower level loops. It uses Breath of the Wild as an example. So the core loop of Breath of the Wild, as we discussed, was walking, attacking, and collecting. The secondary loop could be collecting monster parts, finding armor, and finding fairy fountains. And then the tertiary loop could be completing all the side quests, unlocking all the areas, and finding all 900 Korok seeds. So notice that the core loop of the game has a minute-to-minute timescale, the secondary loop has an hour-to-hour timescale, and the tertiary loop could take quite a few days to complete. This helps keep the player engaged for longer. It also adds depth, since the player now has to consider multiple goal levels in their decision making. They have multiple levels, or they have multiple different loops that they can choose to progress on at any stage of the game. Alright, so as a summary, we talked about how to design a solid gameplay loop. And when you're designing your core gameplay loop, some elements to keep in mind are having a clear objective, making it a compelling game loop, making it thematically cohesive and easy to iterate upon. Being mindful of feedback loops and balancing game progression. So use positive feedback loops to reward the player, but don't overuse it or else you'll snowball the game out of control. And use negative feedback loops to bring more balance. But don't overuse those either or else you'll send the player mixed messages. And then lastly, structure your loops effectively to maintain engagement. So have many different layers or levels of loops to add depth to your game. And once again, keep all of these ideas in mind, but don't be afraid to experiment and change up the form. So the breakout room activity is to just analyze and break down the game loop of a game you like. And that's the end of this lecture.